I can do this without knocking things over. So good evening. First of all, I just want to say that I'm delighted and honored to be here and to have this opportunity to present my book, Colonial al Andalus. I want to thank Emily and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for organizing the event. I also want to thank my colleague, Nasser Mirhan, whom I just met, and we have in common, for joining us and for participating in the conversation. And I want to thank all of you for showing up and showing your interest in the work. I look forward to talking about it with you. It's good to see some old friends and also some new faces in the audience. As Emily mentioned, the structure is going to be that I'm going to give a kind of 20-minute overview of what the book's about, its main argument, what I think its interventions are. Then we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open up the floor for your questions and comments. So let me just jump in by saying that this book, Colonial al Andalus, explores the culture, politics, and legacies of Spanish colonialism in Morocco. It focuses on how Spanish and Moroccan writers, artists, and politicians used the memory of Al-Andalus to understand and debate the colonial encounter between Spain and Morocco. Before I get into the book's main argument, I want to say something about how it came to this topic, because actually it started off as something very different than what it turned out to be. It actually started off as a dissertation project on Al-Andalus, that is on medieval Muslim Iberia. In 2007, I went to Morocco to work on that dissertation project, landing first in Fez and then eventually in the northern city of Tetuan. And 10 years later, I've emerged with this book that's not about Al-Andalus, but it's rather about modern Spanish-Moroccan relations and about the political uses of Al-Andalus in modern Spanish and Moroccan culture. So in other words, I made the jump from the medieval to the modern and from Al-Andalus proper to the cultural afterlife of Al-Andalus. And I'd like to say something about how that transformation happened. During that first year in Morocco, I started to become interested in an idea. It was an idea that was popping up everywhere, seemingly, in the books that I was reading, the lectures that I was attending, the tourist sites that I was visiting, and even in casual conversations with friends and colleagues in Morocco. The idea went as follows. The culture of Al-Andalus did not disappear in 1492. Rather, it migrated from the Iberian Peninsula to Morocco, where it continues and continued to thrive until the present day. In other words, the culture of Al-Andalus lives on in Morocco, and modern Moroccan culture, or at least some parts of it, descend directly from Al-Andalus. In my book, I call this idea the Andalus-centric narrative of Moroccan history. So as I heard this idea repeated to me over and over again, I started to take it more seriously, or just to pause and consider it. I wanted to know what exactly did Moroccans mean, or what do Moroccans mean when they claim descent from Al-Andalus? And when did they start making that claim? When did they start talking about their Andalusi roots in those terms? Was I witnessing a cultural memory that had been preserved intact and transmitted from generation to generation from the 15th century on? Or was I instead seeing a much more recent phenomenon? That was the kind of question that brought me to this project. So just to take a step back, I should say that this idea wasn't just a curiosity that I had in that first year in Morocco. It's actually a story that's quite pervasive in Morocco, quite pervasive in Moroccan historiography, literature, tourism, and political discourse. You don't have to take my word for it. I'm just going to give you a few examples so that you can see how broad of a reach this idea, this kind of Andalus-centric narrative of Moroccan history, how broad of a reach it has. So I'm going to start off with historiography and just say that several prominent Moroccan historians from the 1950s to the present have really claimed that Al-Andalus is an essential part of Moroccan national identity. Along these lines, Mohammed bin Aboud has written that, and I quote, "The footprints of Al-Andalus in Morocco remain deeply rooted, and they constitute an integral part of the Moroccan socio-cultural fabric." He goes on to claim that Moroccan identity, quote, "would not be comprehensible without the Andalusi heritage." Now, assertions like this are not limited to scholarly writings. Al-Andalus also figures very prominently in contemporary Moroccan artistic production. Some of Morocco's most distinguished novelists and poets, such as bin Salim Hamish or Mohammed as-Sabah, have written important important works with Andalusi themes. Also, Andalusi music is often called Morocco's national music and is commonly featured on national television, at weddings, at official functions, and many different kinds of celebrations. Al Andalus is also a major driver of tourism to Morocco, the country's second largest source of income. Since 1992, the 5th centennial of the fall of Granada, Spain and Morocco have collaborated on a number of different tourism initiatives and exhibitions whose objective is to celebrate the two countries' shared Andalusi heritage. And finally, Al Andalus is not only big business in Morocco, it's also a matter of national doctrine. In fact, even the preamble to the most recent Moroccan constitution from 2011 highlights the influence of Al Andalus on Moroccan national identity. So as you can see, this story that I became fascinated in 2007 is a story that actually has a lot of political and cultural weight behind it. And Al Andalus has become a key component of contemporary Moroccan culture and politics. My book, Colonial al Andalus, responds to this idea, and it argues that Morocco's Andalusi identity is not in fact a medieval legacy, but is instead a modern invention that emerged from the colonial encounter between Spain and Morocco in the 19th and 20th centuries. Let me outline in very broad strokes the process through which this invention took place. This is more or less the historical arc of the book, and then we can go into specific case studies later if you're curious. It's a process that dates back to the Spanish Moroccan War of 1859 to 1860, the war that marked the beginning of Spanish colonialism in Morocco. During that war, Spanish writers such as Pedro Antonio de Alarcón revived the historical memory of Al Andalus and used it to emphasize Spain's historical connection to North Africa and to justify Spain's colonial projects in Morocco. The logic here was that Spain wasn't colonizing Morocco, it was simply returning to Morocco, which was always part of Al Andalus and Spain. Now, this strategic use of Spain's Muslim past became a pillar of Spanish colonial discourse in the 19th and 20th centuries. Surprisingly, it was particularly important during the Spanish Civil War, when Franco and his collaborators used Al Andalus as a rhetorical tool to recruit approximately 80,000 Moroccan soldiers to fight in their rebel army. And I say surprisingly, and I'll talk a little later about why this use by Francoists is a little bit surprising. To ensure Moroccan support for the rebel cause, Franco also embarked on this vast propaganda campaign to present himself as a defender of Islam and of the Andalusi heritage. This campaign had a number of different surprising episodes and went in several different directions. Perhaps one of the most surprising is Franco's sponsorship of the Moroccan pilgrimage to Mecca and Medinah, a sponsorship that began in 1937, 6 months into the Spanish Civil War, and continued on into the 1950s. At the same time, Franco granted unprecedented freedoms to the Moroccan nationalist movement, including the legalization of Morocco's first nationalist parties, and also the creation and active funding of several of Morocco's first Arabic-language nationalist newspapers. From these key incubators of Moroccan nationalist thought, forged in the opening months of the Spanish Civil War, there emerged this call for the creation of a Moroccan national culture, articulated as such, as a Moroccan national culture, whose cornerstone would be Morocco's Andalusi heritage. Now, significantly, the Moroccan scholars and politicians who led this charge, the charge to celebrate their country's Andalusi identity, were almost all products of the Spanish colonial education system and of the colonial research institutions created under Franco. Many of them also went on to become prominent figures in post-independence Morocco. So, in one of the eloquent ironies of colonial history, the Spanish insistence on Morocco's Andalusi heritage, which had initially served as a justification of colonialism, galvanized the Moroccan culture, national culture that would supplant colonial rule. In other words, a Spanish way of talking about Morocco became, over time, a Moroccan way of talking about Morocco. So that, in short, is the book's argument. I should, of course, say that there are some caveats to the argument, that over time, as you talk about your project, you realize questions that immediately come up, so I'll see if I can neutralize some of them, or at least respond to them. I should clarify off the bat that I'm not denying that there is, in fact, a significant history of cultural and material exchange between the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. And I'm also not contesting the well-documented fact that tens of thousands of Andalusis left Al-Andalus, left the Iberian Peninsula, and migrated to North Africa from the end of the 15th to the beginning of the 17th century, and that this Andalusi migration did in fact have a significant impact on North African culture. What I'm saying is that the way that Moroccans wrote and talked about Al-Andalus changed as a result of Spanish colonialism, Spanish colonialism did not invent Al Andalus. What it did was create or inaugurate a new narrative about how Morocco became Andalusi, and how that Andalusiness, how Morocco's Andalusi identity manifests in the modern era. It's a colonial narrative that stresses the migration of the people and culture of Al-Andalus from the Iberian Peninsula to Morocco after 1492. And most importantly, it's one that stresses a specific repertoire of cultural practices in which Morocco's Andalusi identity supposedly resides. Now, these practices include things like music and architecture, but they also extend to other domains of life, like dialect, clothing, and even the Moroccan understanding of Islam, all of which were attributed in one way or another to Al-Andalus by Spanish scholars. I'm going to give you an example of the colonial narrative to which I'm referring. The example comes from a book called Marruecos Andalus, Andalusian Morocco, published by Rodolfo Gil Ben Umayya in 1942, in the early years of the Franco regime. And I quote from that book. In 1492 and in 1610, the majority of Muslims from Andalusia and Murcia went to Morocco. There they founded neighborhoods and cities where they faithfully preserved and reproduced all of the customs of their land of origin. Fez, Tetuan, and Rabat are the three great Andalusian capitals. They gave a Hispano-Muslim organization to the Moroccan state and government, and to Moroccan Islam, they gave a local air that does not exist in the countries of the East, because it originates on the shores of the Guadalquivir. Thanks to Fez, Tetuan, and Rabat, Morocco eventually became a living museum where the Andalusia of the Middle Ages remains intact. So, like many intellectuals of the Francoist period, Gil Ben Umayya stresses the cultural continuity between medieval Al-Andalus and modern Morocco. In fact, he goes so far as to call Morocco a, quote, living museum of Al-Andalus. In this passage, he also attributes the organization of the Moroccan state and even the nature of Moroccan Islam itself to Al-Andalus. And this is really one of the common strategies that Spanish colonial thinkers used to position themselves as experts on Moroccan culture, by essentially arguing that Moroccan culture at its core was fundamentally from Spain, Spanish. And there are kind of various iterations on this theme throughout Gil Ben Umayya's book. In the same chapter, for example, he calls Moroccan houses, and I quote, miniature alhambras. He also says that Moroccan music is, and I quote, the very same music of the Andalusian court, that which the orchestras of Al-Andalus played before the Muslim sovereigns. So Gil Ben Umayya's book, I'm arguing, is a good illustration of the Spanish colonial narrative about Morocco and Al-Andalus. It's a narrative that highlights, as I said, the migration of the people and culture of Al-Andalus to Morocco, and also the unbroken transmission of Andalusi culture from the medieval period to the present. An Andalusi culture that's manifested in these different cultural practices, like the miniature Alhambra houses or the music that has changed, that has been, unchanged since the 15th century. One of the things that my book tries to do is to show how this colonial narrative made it from the Spanish colonial milieu to Moroccan culture, largely through the work of Moroccan scholars and politicians who began their careers in the Spanish colonial administration and went on after independence to join many of Morocco's newly created national institutions, particularly the Moroccan National Library, the Royal Archive, the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Culture. So I'm kind of trying to trace this migration of people and ideas that started in the colonial milieu and after independence made their way into kind of Moroccan official culture, official state culture. Along the way, Al-Andalus became a centerpiece of Moroccan national identity, and the artistic practices associated with Al-Andalus became something akin to a Moroccan national style. So before concluding these introductory remarks and moving on to the conversation, I'd like to address the so what question. As I say, I'd like to address the reasons why I think this book might matter, or at least why I hope you'll find that it matters. The first reason is a pretty basic one, and it has to do with my methodology and my archive. This is a book that examines a very diverse array of Arabic, Spanish, French, and Catalan sources that span a number of different domains, from literature and historiography to journalism, political speeches, tourist brochures, monuments, and visual culture. But I really want to highlight the question of language here, because that's really key. For reasons that I explore in the book, I think that colonial era Moroccan culture in Arabic has largely been ignored by Arabists in the United States and Europe. In Spain, it is true that there's a very rich tradition of scholarship on Hispano-Arab cultural interactions, but this scholarship has focused almost exclusively on the medieval period and in general has ignored the extensive body of Moroccan writings in Arabic from the colonial period. So on a very basic level, the book is just trying to recover and reconsider some forgotten history figures and texts from the colonial period. The book also challenges, I think, some very common assumptions about modern Spanish history. And this was a piece that I was discussing with James Monroe just before the talk today. For those of you who are Hispanists in the audience or are familiar with the scholarship on Spain, you'll know that the scholarship on modern Spain has generally treated the Spanish Civil War as a kind of rupture that separates two irreconcilable views of Spain. On the one hand are the Republicans, who advocate for a pluralistic Spain that is tolerant of regional, linguistic, cultural, and religious difference. And on the other hand are the Francoists, right, who fight for this kind of monocultural, monolingual, imperial, and Catholic Spain. So in this bifurcated view that's kind of come down to us, the celebration of Al Andalus is almost always associated with the Republican cause, and more broadly with liberal and progressive understandings of Spanish history. And what I'm trying to argue in this book is, in fact, that the celebration of Al Andalus was also a very significant piece of Spanish fascist culture, particularly during the colonial period in Morocco. As I try to show, Spanish colonial writers and politicians of all ideological stripes justified Spain's role as a colonizer by celebrating the Andalusi heritage, and by highlighting the cultural, historical, and even racial proximity between Spain and Morocco. So that's the way in which the book tries to respond to Spanish historiography. I also think that the book challenges some common assumptions about Moroccan history. Many Moroccan historians of the early independence period have depicted Moroccan independence as a complete rupture with the colonial past and as a restoration of Moroccan national unity. My book challenges this narrative of rupture, and in so doing it's trying to join a body of scholarship that is aiming to show how the colonial past continues to shape and inform political and cultural debates in Morocco today. In particular, I'm trying to show how one of the key pillars of post-independence cultural identity in Morocco has a colonial genealogy. So in other words, I'm trying to challenge here two ruptures that have structured our understanding of modern Spanish and modern Moroccan history. On the one hand, the rupture of the Spanish Civil War, and on the other hand, the rupture of Moroccan independence. And in both cases, I try to trace the people and the ideas that traverse these supposed ruptures and bring into relief surprising alliances between projects that we often think as incompatible, such as colonialism and anti-colonial nationalism, fascism and Moroccan Salafia. I could go on. There's a number of ways in which this book tries to bring into relief alliances between actors who we don't normally place together. Another intervention that my book stages is, of course, my focus on Spanish colonialism in Morocco instead of French colonialism, right? Up until now, Moroccan colonial history has largely been narrated from the perspective of French colonialism and the various reactions that it elicited among Moroccans living in the French zone. My book tries to reimagine the story of modern Moroccan culture from a northern perspective, based in Tetuan, Tangier, and Ceuta, instead of Fez, Rabat, and Casablanca. Now, I think that this geographic reorientation not only brings into relief or brings new spaces and historical figures into the limelight, but it also, I hope, gives us an opportunity to think about new ways of theorizing and narrating the colonial encounter between Europe and North Africa. Up until now, Edward Said's Orientalism has had a really large influence on how scholars have studied the history and discourse of European colonialism in North Africa. As you well know, Said's book proposes a model of colonialism that is based on a pretty firm distinction between Orient and Occident, a distinction that assumes the alterity of the Orient and the superiority of the Occident. This is what Said means when he calls Orientalism, and I quote, a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. My book is trying to unsettle these apparently neat distinctions between Orient and Occident, colonizer and colonized. After all, the rhetorical justification for Spanish colonialism was not difference, but rather similarity. It was not the distance between Spain and Morocco, but rather the proximity between them. Likewise, one of the main rhetorical tools of the Spanish colonial imaginary was appropriated by Moroccan nationalists and put to the service of new projects. So in other words, my book is trying to tell a story of strange bedfellows and of ideological contradictions. Contradictions that I believe undercut some of the master narratives that have structured my field. And I'm hoping that this dimension of my argument will be productive not only for people who work on colonial Morocco, but also for people who are working on colonialism in other cultural and geographic contexts. All right, I'm going to stop here to transition to the conversation portion, but I look forward to your questions, and thanks so much for your attention and your interest.
If we can turn off that light.
I did bring in some images to respond to some of the questions on the guys. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you. That was certainly food for thought. I'm going to be brief because I'm not a literature person, and once I read the book, I realized that it's not only a study of literature, it's a truly interdisciplinary book, which is rare actually to find at all, let alone among North Africanists, if you consider yourself North Africanist. So I say that sort of to underline how I've known Eric for several years. We travel in similar circles, and he's always been this very mild-mannered, friendly guy. This is the most radical book. This book is I was blown away by so much of what you're doing. It's incredibly, you're upsetting many fields, and you're taking great intellectual risks, and I bravo, Mabruk. I mean, really, it's very forceful and surprising and new, and I really appreciate that. Part of its radicalness is its interdisciplinarity. I think also the way I'm coming from this as a Moroccan historian, the way that you're reframing Moroccan history is very radical when you say, moving from the center to the north. In the center, you say Tetuan, or you say Fez, Rabat, Casablanca. As you know, I work on Marrakesh in the south of Marrakesh. So for me, the whole history that you're telling and retelling and reframing, in fact, for me, is very much an Amazigh, Berber history. For me, as someone who works on southern Morocco, I've always thought Al Andalus's dirty secret is in fact not dirty, if you will. It is in fact that it's Amazigh. And so I wonder, from that, if you could talk a little bit about what I see as some of these exceptions, not to your argument, but perhaps to the argument being made in both Spanish historiography and Moroccan historiography, but being made differently, I think, in each. But I would like you to elaborate on this a little bit. These exceptions to this creation of an Andalusi identity and the uses of it. One, the fact that part of what the Spanish take in terms of territory in Morocco is not just Ceuta and Melilla or the north, but it's also that funny little piece of the Sahara that's causing so much trouble politically in Morocco today, and I would say is the #1 issue, political issue in Morocco today. We hear about Ceuta and Melilla because of immigration, but I think the Western Sahara question internally in Morocco is huge. So how did they get around? I don't see that. I think you mentioned it briefly, but how is that? Because that doesn't fit in with the Andalusi argument. This is not an Hispano-Arab area. By the same token, the South in general. By the same token, the Al-Muwahhidun and Al-Murabitun, the Al-Muwahhads and the Al-Murabit. You talked about that a little bit, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to talk about them here. And then even, because I have my class here, some members of my class on Jews and Muslims, where do the Jews, who are not necessarily Sephardic Jews, fit into this? It's a very broad question, but those kinds of exceptions.
Let me see if I can take parts of that. So in the book, I at times will talk about Moroccan national identity in singular, not because I think that Morocco can be, the kind of sheer heterogeneity of Morocco can be reduced to one singular identity, but rather I'm trying to look at the kind of creation of an almost state-sanctioned, official, and centralized identity project, which is often articulated in the singular, both by Spaniards and by Moroccans. And so all national imaginaries include some and exclude others, and this is no exception. I mean, I should also say that all national imaginaries are anachronistic by nature. I mean, they very often project a sense of national identity back onto some deep past that precedes them. What's interesting about this case, perhaps even unique or at least rare, is that you have the example of two different competing national imaginaries projecting themselves onto the same distant past. And so this anachronistic movement of national imaginaries is something that you see in many places. You know, I'm from Boston, we can think the Pilgrims. You know, every country has a mythic past. But in this example, you have two different ideological and national projects projecting themselves onto this shared past, which is interesting. And it requires a lot of finesse. That would be a nice way to put it. Conflation would be another person to put it. Convenient elision would be another way to put it. I think that there are ways in which Arabness as ethnicity, Arabic as language, and Islam as religion get conveniently put together in different combinations in the Spanish colonial discourse to create these kind of malleable alliances, so that in some cases the Andalusi heritage might be used to talk about a kind of trans-historical relationship between Christianity and Islam, so framed in religious terms, and other times it might be framed in more cultural or national terms. And certainly there are many aspects of Moroccan identity and Moroccan culture, and even Moroccans living under Spanish colonial domains that are not included in this project. I would say that it's a project, and I think that in part this is why it was so successful in being appropriated by Moroccans. It was a project that facilitated the creation of a kind of urban and Arab-centric Moroccan identity, one that excluded many other identities. We could include the Berbers. But I want to pause on that and say that's not entirely true. I mean, I think that the Spanish were very interested in including in the Andalusi heritage the Almoravids and the Almohads. And basically, the Spanish dismissed the Arab-Berber distinction as a creation, as an invention of French ethnography. Which is not to say that they denied the linguistic reality that there were different languages spoken in Morocco. I think the strategy was more to assume that the idea that there's a pure ethnic division that then maps onto these different kind of fundamental essences of characters, ones in which the Berbers were seen to be having a kind of more superficial attachment to Islam and therefore maybe could be more easily assimilable to the European colonial project. The Spanish very much cast themselves in opposition to that view, and so whether or not everyone would agree, they saw Al-Andalus as a unifying factor that brought together Arabs and Berbers. Whether or not Arabs and Berbers actually saw it that way is a separate question. The Jewish question is a really interesting one. I have a separate article that I wrote that it has about half of the argument of this book and not the other half. And I'll tell you the half it has and the other half it doesn't, because I think the distinction is telling. The Spanish also, during this same period, were reviving their Sephardic heritage and using it very strategically as a mode of promoting cultural and political and commercial alliances between Spain and the Sephardic diaspora, not only in Morocco, but very much especially in Morocco. This was part of the colonial project. There are ways in which this story maps pretty well into my book. It's a project that was used by the Spanish, but was also had the frequent and very important collaboration of Moroccan Jews, sustaining this idea of the Sephardic heritage being a glue linking together Spain and Morocco. Another key difference is that it links together the Francoist and the Republican and Francoist periods. I think there's a tendency to assume that in the same way that Francoism was hostile to Islam, which it sometimes was and sometimes wasn't, this is what my book tries to show, Francoism was also very interested in supporting and celebrating the Sephardic heritage. And in fact, the most famous Spanish journal of Sephardic studies, of Jewish studies, which is called Sefarad, was founded in 1939 by Franco, just after the Spanish Civil War, very explicitly to try to solidify these links between Spanish Hebrew scholars and Moroccan Jews. So why does that story not make it into my book? And why did I kind of separate it? I mean, there are a lot of reasons why something doesn't make it into the book. The main one is that this book is most interested in ideas that start in one imaginary and make their way across to another. And my argument is that that piece of the Spanish colonial project was not as integral to the fashioning of a Moroccan nationalist discourse in the 40s and 50s.
It is now.
It is now. It is, and so I think that there are ways in which it has come back.
Yeah.
And so this is a book very much about the sort of Morocco that emerges in the 50s and the 60s. Why? What are the kind of major assumptions and narratives they have about Moroccan history? How do certain institutions get created? And so my argument is that the Spanish celebration of Sefarad, unlike the Spanish celebration of Al Andalus, does not become a significant piece of kind of official Moroccan culture until much later. Until like, I think this is a very, very recent. Yeah. So I don't think I responded to all. I responded to
Just the last
some.
part about the Western Sahara.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the Western Sahara was always a kind of uncomfortable piece of the Spanish colonial project. I mean discursively, putting aside the kind of geopolitics of it. I think the Spanish, in early iterations of the colonization of the Western Sahara, did try to use selectively the kind of Andalusi heritage argument. It didn't catch, it didn't work quite as well. And eventually, it kind of fell from view. And so this discourse about Spain and Andalus was definitely something that they used not only in the north, but also very significantly, I think, to talk about the French zone as well. So it's interesting that they didn't use it as much to talk about the Sahara. In fact, hold on, let me see if I can get this quote here. The fact that he says one of the three great Andalusian capitals are Fez, Tetuan, and Rabat. The fact that two of those are in the French zone is significant here. The Spanish are claiming actually that this heritage that they're celebrating, it's not just our little corner of the north here. This is in fact something that very much undermines French colonial authority as well. The Sahara didn't make it in there quite as much. And there are kind of shifting explanations for why that is. One of the most famous ones is the idea that there was that the Strait of Gibraltar is not actually what separates Spain and Morocco, that that's actually a very recent tectonic phenomenon, and that the shift happens further to the south in the Atlas, and that historically everything from Fez up was actually historically part of the same landmass. And there's a whole subdiscipline of Francoist geography and geology devoted to trying to prove this idea that that part of Morocco and Spain are actually not just racially and culturally linked, but actually were once part of the exact same landmass. And so that's another way of saying, well, Western Sahara is kind of this different thing. Yeah.
Well, thanks again. We're very happy that you joined us here today. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. I have 19 questions, but to avoid expulsion, I'll stick with it. But before I get to the question, I just briefly wanted to mention something as a junior scholar, and I think also addressing my fellow junior scholars here. There's perhaps three things I found most promising about your book. One was you present us with certain hypotheses and then you deliver them. So it's always refreshing because when you start each chapter with a proposal and you clearly lead us to that without really going off on tangents, which I found admirable. The other is, I think, your choice of certain words was made it impossible to stop reading. So when you see a chapter called Franco's Hajj, you want to read that because you want to know why is Franco a pilgrim, and then you realize what you mean by Franco's Hajj. And the last one I think is it is really hard to face certain conclusions you have made. It feels, as you turn the pages, it feels like you're getting a slap in the face after the other with figures that you kind of never thought about in this very nationalistic discourse. You go from, and both on the Spanish and the Arab divide, and not only in Morocco, right? There's also some Levantine figures that appear that I'll address a little bit. So I'll start with the kind of one of the biggest questions I had in mind, and then maybe one small one, and then we can open up for the public if that's good.
Sure.
And this is kind of coming from your chapter 5, the invention of the Hispano-Arabic culture by yes, there you go. So I think in many, and when I'm talking about Franco, by the way, I'm talking about Franco's institutions as well. Just to simplify, I'll say Franco. But so for this type of renaissance to occur for Franco's regime, there is a preceding dormant state that is necessarily to have existed, and that always happens when you need some sort of renaissance. You have to prove that you're coming out of dark ages. Obviously, that's one of the biggest problems we face in medieval studies, to show why that argument is problematic. But so in the case of Hispano-Arabic culture, it seems to me that what is suggested by this whole discourse is that before this rupture, so we have 400 years, right, that have transpassed, and that before that it was, rather than a deliberate extermination of Spain's Islamic and Jewish and Semitic heritage, there's kind of almost like an accidental coma that was induced. I was wondering, how did Franco's regime navigate this gap as they try to resurrect this suddenly, right? As you say, you consistently use the surprising, and it is surprising, right? How suddenly Franco, as you show in one of the other images I asked you to, as this proto-Catholic, completely purified Spain, at the same time is proposing that there is a possible return. How do they address that gap, the jump of a few centuries?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So what Nasser is asking about is this concept that I call, that Francoists call Hispano-Arab culture, which I argue is an idea that was invented by Francoists in part to justify their colonialism in Morocco, and in part to distinguish themselves from the French. And it's not that the word Hispano-Arab didn't exist before Francoism. It goes back to the 19th century. But what Francoism did was kind of invent this concept of Hispano-Arab culture and endow it with this very specific historical narrative, and also with a whole institutional apparatus whose purpose was to celebrate it not only in Morocco but throughout the Arab world, especially in Cairo and the Levant, but in other places as well. And so the kind of epicenter of this project was this thing called the General Franco Institute for Hispano-Arab Research, which, like many of the institutions I study in the book, was founded in the Spanish Civil War in 1938, basically to publish works that celebrate the historical and cultural links between Spain and Morocco. And the kind of main thesis of almost everything that came out of this, hold on, I just want to set up your question so everyone's on the same page. The kind of main thesis that came out of these publications was this idea that the Spanish protectorate marked the Renaissance or the rebirth of Hispano-Arab culture, or at times just the rebirth of Al Andalus. Sometimes they would frame it as the rebirth of Cordoba. As this is a quote from Berkeley, who is the High Commissioner of Spain. This is from a speech he gave in 1939. And so, if I understand your question correctly, you say in order for there to be a Renaissance, there has to be a dormancy. How did the Spanish how did Francoists account for this long-standing dormancy in Hispano-Arab culture? It's a good question. I think that Francoism was very invested in ideas of rebirth and renewal. One of the Francoist tropes for describing the Francoist project in Spain was to call themselves the New Spain. And so this was of a piece with the kind of language of resurgence or revival that was part of the Francoist project. If you read some of these early publications of the Hispano-Arab Research Center, the General Franco Institute, particularly the one by this guy, Tomás García Figueras, who was the kind of Franco's right-hand man in Morocco and the first director of this institute. It's a book that's called Marruecos, Morocco, but it actually tells the story of the Western Mediterranean starting from prehistoric times to the present. And basically his argument is that that Spain, long before it was called Spain, has been at the center of two conflicting antagonistic forces, one of which he calls Spain and one of which he calls the anti-Spain. And so the Francoist argument is that Francoism is the revival of a certain model of Spain whose antagonists include the Republic, the Bourbon dynasty, but strangely, and this is really surprising, most people would assume Francoists were aligning themselves, for example, with the Catholic monarchs, which they do in other cases. But in the example of Morocco, they say actually the moment in which the anti-Spain emerges is precisely the moment in which Spain lost contact with its Muslim and Jewish heritage. And so the dormancy period is precisely this period between, say, roughly 1492 and 1936, in which the anti-Spain became dominant, and the Spain that is kind of reviving and that sees Arab and Arabic culture as integral parts of Spain. And in fact, Medinah, who's the High Commissioner of Spain, he kind of says this. He describes, this is in this big public event they had in 1939, to greet actually a Lebanese writer who was visiting the Spanish Protectorate. The General Franco Institute was responsible for bringing in many visitors from the Arab world in order to kind of write, to show them the ways in which Francoism was celebrating and protecting the Andalusi heritage in Morocco. And Medinah describes the Spanish Protectorate as the renaissance of Arab culture, of Arab feeling, of Arabic letters, and of a civilization that is an integral part of Spain. We want Cordoba to rise again from its ashes. And so there's this idea that the Spain that sees Arabness and Arabic culture and Islam, and I know I'm lumping those together, but very often there was this kind of collision between the ethnic, the cultural, and the religious. So I'll do that as well. The people who see that as an integral part of Spanish history are the Francoists, and the people who don't are the anti-Spain, who are their most recent example of which is the Republic.
Thank you, Dan. And sadly, it seems to have worked in some of those cases, right? In chapter 1, Eric mentions, chapter 5, the same one, how, and I was telling you that was one moment when I had to close the book because I was so angry. It's when Amin Rehani, one of the most prominent intellectuals of al-Mahjar, or the literature in exile, called Averroes El Caudillo, which is Franco's title. So some of the figures that were responding to these invitations were very much influenced by the.
Yeah, actually, this is a quote from Amin al-Rehani, who visited Morocco as an official guest of Franco's government in 1939, and wrote, Colonel Belbede, who was the High Commissioner of Spain, of the Spanish Protectorate, was crazy with love and devotion for the Arabs and with his desire to renew Hispano-Arab culture and to invigorate it in Morocco. So Amin al-Rehani is just one of many different Arab intellectuals who visited Spain and then kind of propagated this specific narrative about Francoism being a defender of Al Andalus in Arabic to a kind of far-flung Arabic readership far beyond Morocco.
And so I think I'll choose another concept I think could be of general interest. I would like you to elaborate on a term you coined, which is transperipheral, and how it can problematize such texts. You used the example of Infantes, Ideal, right? Yeah. But perhaps how we could use that term, what did you mean exactly?
Yeah, so in an earlier version of the book, I had more transperipheral, and my editor said, that's way too wonky, no one wants to get transperipheral. So I had to excise, but I'm glad that you noticed it, because I thought it was a useful term as well. So I'll talk about it. But I mean, this is basically about the ways in which arguments about the relationship between Spain and Morocco inevitably become arguments about Spain's and Morocco, because the time of the emergence of Spanish colonialism in Morocco coincides with the emergence and consolidation of several different peripheral nationalist discourses in Spain. Most famously, Catalonia and the Basque Country, but I also talk about the example of Andalusian nationalism in the book. And kind of what I'm trying to say there is that for many of these peripheral nationalist projects in the 19th and 20th centuries, arguments that Al Andalus became a venue or an arena for debating various alternatives of what it meant to be Spanish or Catalan or Andalusian or Basque. And one of the, I guess kind of perverse things I try to do in that chapter, so at one point I was a bureaucrat for the Catalan government, and so I have great love for the Catalans, I should say this, but I think it's important to acknowledge that much of Catalan nationalist discourse from the 19th century, and I would say more or less to the present, has been constructed in opposition to a notion of Spain being somehow backward, different, African. I think that when people say Catalonia is the most European part of Spain, or Barcelona, it's not like Madrid, it's more forward-looking, it's advanced. That's a highly coded discourse that goes back to 19th century ideas about how the Catalans racially and culturally come from across the Pyrenees, whereas the rest of Spain somehow is racially mixed with Arabs, Jews, Muslims, and there are different versions of this. And so the transperipheral is this term that I use to describe the ways in which different peripheral nationalist discourses come into contact with each other and debate with each other in a way that doesn't necessarily pass through Madrid, but is kind of happening all around the peripheries of a centralized Spain. So, and does that respond to your question?
Great, yeah, thank you so much. I just thought it would be
Let's go ahead and open it up then. So you can,
Yes, and yeah, but what's your name?
Professor Diab.
What?
Ahmed Diab.
Ahmed, thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this is very thought-provoking for a lot of people from a lot of disciplines.
Sure.
I haven't heard that, I didn't know that Franco made a claim that they're Muslim or claim to common Muslim heritage.
Yeah.
But this reminds me of Napoleonic expedition to Egypt. I mean, the same claim was made
Sure.
with far less substance, let's say,
Sure.
with
Sure.
notoriously broken
Yes.
Arabic. That's the subject of Jabarti's
Yeah.
sarcasm and rebuke. So, how does this compare to other Europe? Because you make the argument in the talk. I haven't read the book. I look forward to it. That this is somewhat. This presents a different approach to Saidian critique of classical Orientalism.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of ways, this is classical Orientalism. The claim that these parts of Morocco are, in essence, unchanged, the same
Sure.
as this is the hallmark of classical Orientalism.
Mhm.
It's an artifact of nature, as
Yes.
Said called it,
Sure.
referring to coding Orientalists.
Yeah.
That is. So I'm not so convinced that this is such a departure
Sure.
from classical critiques of Orientalism. That's one.
Can I respond to that part? Because that's a good question.
Okay.
and then we.
I don't want to dominate yeah.
No. So yeah, no. It's a great question. I think there are two things that I'm trying to do that I think are different, and I'll try to explain what they are. Those like the Napoleonic appropriation or adoption or strategic use of a kind of Muslim identity might cut against this argument. But I do think, at very least in the context of Morocco and in other contexts as well, the difference between Spanish Orientalism and, say, other European varieties has to do with the rhetorical positioning of Spain vis-a-vis that category. That I think that the French also shared an idea of Morocco as a kind of unchanging idea, and also were interested in the idea that maybe Al Andalus could be seen in the French parts of Morocco. But they never claimed that necessarily as part of their own culture. That is to say, there's a kind of similar historic dynamic, but precisely that unchanging essence was seen as a sign of alterity, not as a sign of similarity. And in fact, like for the Spanish, this rhetorical positioning of saying, well, we're not only do we understand Moroccan culture is part of our culture. It is I don't know if it's still up there, an integral part of Spanish history. I think is a pretty significant difference in the kind of rhetorical positioning between the European subject and the way that they understand their relationship both to this colonized space and to Islam more broadly construed. So that's kind of like one, I think the rhetorical positioning, even as the Spanish use Orientalist discourses, they simultaneously make themselves the object of them in a way that I don't think is very clear in the kind of classic French or British Orientalist traditions. The other example, and I think I should say that like anyone in this field, I have nothing but the utmost respect for Said, who I think is absolutely brilliant. And he's very honest in his book that actually about what Orientals have to say about their own history, his book has very little to say about that. Like one of the critiques of him is that he has too monolithic a view of the difference between East and West. The other is what about the response of colonized peoples to colonialism, because it's really fundamentally a book about European discourse. The thing that I'm trying to argue as well is that this is this weird and interesting case in which discourses and projects that emerged within the center of the colonial project were then adopted and appropriated very, very significantly by these colonized actors and remain on into the present day as these kind of key signs or signifiers of Moroccan national identity. And so in the same way that I don't think that a connection to Napoleon is written into the Egyptian constitution in the way that a connection to Al Andalus is written into the Moroccan constitution, I think the success of this discursive project it had a much different afterlife and was successful in incorporating or infiltrating Moroccan culture uses in a way that, say, a high Orientalism, de la Croix, for example, wouldn't necessarily be so. So that would be my response to that first question. What was your second question?
To what extent do you account for, other approaches to the same history? Because I'm thinking of some people like Najati Sadqi, for example. I'm not sure if you're aware.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, this Palestinian one-time communist who was dispatched by the Comintern to go to Spain during the Civil War, specifically tasked with dissuading Moroccan Franquistas from fighting on Franco's side. Yeah. And his part of his memoirs are translated, not all of them, but I have this part that I actually worked on, and he makes the same claim to being in Spain on the Republican side as almost it could be a Franco claim in what we're learning from you. He says when he's walking in Barcelona and he meets a group of armed men, and their chief approached me thinking I was Spanish, addressed me in Spanish, why don't you join our forces? I smiled and answered in French with youthful enthusiasm. I'm an Arab volunteer. I came to defend liberty in Madrid, to defend Damascus in Guadalajara, to Jerusalem in Cordoba, Baghdad in Cadiz, and so on.
Sure.
So there are other people that are tapping into this history at the same time to make different kind of claims. To what extent do you account for, and the sort of a sub-question of this is, to what extent do you account to Levantine? I mean, Rehani is Lebanese, but he's thought of as this expatriate in the U.S. He's from and he's a proponent of Arab nationalism at large. He has a book in English defending the cause of Palestine in the U.S. from the 20s, I think. So I think it's a little without proper context. This can go in a lot of different directions.
Sure. In fairness, El Rehani is not the only Levantine intellectual who comes into the book. I just picked him because Nasser and I had any more correspondence about the chapter in which he emerges. Those are complicated questions. I don't know if I can fully respond to them, but I'd be happy to continue talking after the event, but I can give you kind of some brief responses. First of all, I certainly wouldn't deny that there's a very significant Republican usage of Al Andalus and an understanding of the Republican cause both during the Civil War and after the Civil War, speaking for not only a progressive version of Spain, but a progressive version of Spain that is specifically linked to the Andalusi heritage. Basically what I'm trying to argue is that that's the only Al Andalus that people seem to remember today. That the Al Andalus of Americo Castro, the Al Andalus of the Tres Culturas, the Al Andalus which is an Al Andalus that is very much resistant to Francoism. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, I'm just saying it's become so hegemonic that we've forgotten that at the exact same time, Francoism was using in these very strategic ways a similar celebration of Al Andalus to different ends. And that takes me to my second point. Now, it's definitely true that the kind of ideological responses to, representations of Al Andalus are all over the place in modern Mediterranean culture, and are certainly not just limited to Morocco. There's a long and venerable tradition of Levantine and Egyptian representations of Al Andalus that have their own ideological valence. What I'm arguing is that in the context of Morocco, it's really the Francoist representations of Al Andalus, and specifically the Francoist collaboration with different Moroccan nationalists that led to the emergence and consolidation of this particular idea of Morocco's Andalusiness. Now that's not either meant to say that there aren't other versions of Al Andalus that exist elsewhere, or to say that there weren't other possible directions. I'm trying to very much isolate the reason I started with this anecdote is you go to Morocco and as I'm sure you know, everyone says, oh, we're from Al Andalus. And I want to know, when did people start talking about this imaginary in this very specific way and link it to these very specific cultural practices? And that's the genealogy that I'm trying to show in the book. You're definitely right to say that it's an Al Andalus that coincides with and competes with many other imaginaries of Al Andalus that are happening at the same time. I have some more to say about the way that Levantine intellectuals figure into this project because they play a pretty significant role, but maybe I'll just hit pause there just to leave room for some of the other questions. Because you're absolutely right. Amina Rehani is one case, but there are other Levantine intellectuals I look at in the course of the book. Oh, sorry, am I
right? You get to choose.
Yes.
So you had a slide in the beginning discussing the classical narrative.
Sure.
You discussed the concept basically that if you entered the Andalus, it would sort of look like a museum of sorts to the historical history of the Andalus. My question is very simple.
Yeah.
Do you agree with this? And as an extension of that, do you think that Moroccan and Arabs in that area, in that region, have created new philosophy, new ideas on music, and have innovated? And yes or no question, and why?
Okay, yeah, big question. I wouldn't say it's a simple one. Yeah, so no, I mean, I'm actually, the whole point of the book is I'm arguing against this idea of Morocco as a living museum of Al Andalus, in which Al Andalus has been preserved untapped without change from the 16th century. And in different chapters in the book, I try to show, for example, I take on very specific instantiations of this narrative. I look at, for example, Moroccan discourses about music, the music that's now called Andalusian music, or Moroccan discourses about specific artistic craft traditions that are now considered part of the Andalusian heritage, and show about how this very explicit connection with Al-Andalus emerged very much in the 20th century as part of these colonial institutions that were built and created to present Morocco as a kind of unchanging museum of Andalusian culture. And so, no, that's the narrative that I'm identifying and arguing against. One that I still think has a lot of power, not only for European Orientalism, but also for, and I wish I had brought in some more quotes to speak to this, but like, there are a lot of also very significant Moroccan cultural figures who talk about the kind of uninterrupted transmission of Al-Andalus from the 15th century to the present in a way that I'm also trying to argue against. The second piece of your question, I'm not sure how to answer it.
No, that was it. I was like, that's great to hear. Okay. Sorry, I should have made that more clear. I'm trying to identify a narrative that I think has a colonial genealogy, one that's very, very problematic, and trying to show the various ways in which it emerged in the context of 19th and 20th century Morocco. Yes?
You mentioned this idea that Al-Andalus was used not only by the Spanish, not only to kind of influence this like Spanish-Moroccan relations, but also with the Arab world at large.
Yes.
And I was wondering how that somehow, at some moments, conflicted with this like Catholic identity.
Mm-hmm.
And this image that came to my mind was like, that you might have seen is Saddam Hussein praying at the Mosque of Cordoba in 1972, I believe.
Sure.
Which is, you know, in the present time, there's this, this controversy over how to call that mosque, if you call it a cathedral or mosque. You know, like how,
of course,
this idea of like Spanish relationship to the Arab world, and even like today's really prevalent view, pro-Palestine view in Spanish politics, kind of conflicted or had some issues with the Catholic side of the regime that was.
Yeah. So, you know, what we now call national Catholicism, which is this idea that there's a kind of natural alignment between the Spanish state and the Spanish Catholic Church was also one of the key ideological features of the Franco regime. And that's like this is a book that tries to identify contradictions without resolving them. A lot of the project has to do with people assuming that these things are contradictory, therefore they're not going to study them, and they don't make sense, let's move on. And it's a book that tries to identify and dwell in contradictions. One of them is, how is it that the Franco that we know, which is the Franco of national Catholicism, was at the same time very actively pursuing these various forms of transcultural alliance that had either a cultural dimension, so to the Arab world, or a religious dimension to the Muslim world. Both pieces were present. I can tell you the ways that Francoism squared that circle. You might not find it convincing, but like they realized that there was a tension there. Basically, from the Civil War onward, the Franco regime presented itself as a kind of alliance of the faithful against the godless. And so in that sense, there was a natural alliance between Muslims and Christians, because their enemy they weren't enemies to each other. In fact, their enemy were people without faith, namely Republicans, communists, and so on. And so that's how Francoism during the Civil War, like for example, when Franco paid to send for years and years all those Moroccan Hajj pilgrims to go on the pilgrimage to Mecca, at the end part of that journey was always that those pilgrims would then have to return to Spain and visit all the Islamic heritage sites of Spain, including the Mosque of Cordoba, pray in the Mosque of Cordoba, and then Franco would deliver speeches about how there was this historical alliance between Islam and Christianity, and they were fighting against the godless, who were, I'm using that in rigorous air quotes, the godless communists. So that's one of the ways in which that was framed. It wasn't always, I mean, I think the kind of